It was the kind of morning that felt like any other, yet it would become the one Marcus remembered for the rest of his life. The air was heavy with the summer heat, the sun already burning through the cracked blinds of their small apartment. The walls, once bright and full of laughter, had begun to show their age. Peeling paint, a flickering light, the smell of dust and faint mold that came from years of neglect by a landlord who never cared enough to fix it. Marcus's mother, Denise, was humming softly as she prepared breakfast, stretching every dollar, every egg, every piece of bread to feed her children. Her voice trembled just enough to betray the exhaustion she carried, but she smiled anyway, like she always did. Marcus was only 14, but he could already see what that smile hid. The endless rent notices, the fear in her eyes when the mail arrived, the uncertainty of what tomorrow would bring. That morning they heard it, the pounding on the door. It wasn't the soft, polite knock of a neighbor. It was sharp, angry, official. When Denise opened it, two men stood there, one in a suit with a clipboard, the other a uniformed officer. The words they spoke hit like a punch: eviction, immediate removal. Marcus didn't understand. His mother had paid what she could, always something, always on time. But the man in the suit didn't care. The building's new owner, a white real estate developer named Richard Connolly, had bought out the block. His plan was to revitalize the area, as he called it. What that really meant was pushing out families like Marcus's to make room for luxury apartments and higher-paying tenants. As Denise tried to reason with them, the officer moved toward the door, waiting to escort them out. Marcus stood frozen, his small hands shaking as he watched his mother beg. But it didn't matter. Papers had been signed. Deals had been made. Their home was no longer theirs. The landlord's men changed the locks before the family had even finished packing. Marcus carried a box filled with their photographs. Birthdays, holidays, moments of joy now tainted by loss. When they stepped outside, the heat hit like a wave, and suddenly, they were part of the long line of families standing on the sidewalk, all victims of the same cruelty. Mothers, fathers, children. All pushed out like trash, their belongings piled high on the curb. That was the day Marcus learned that poverty and skin color could make a person invisible. Cars drove past without stopping. Some people stared but didn't help. It was as if the world had decided their suffering was just another part of the city's noise. For days, they lived out of their car, the one thing they still owned. Denise parked it near the park, away from the main roads, where the streetlights flickered and the nights felt endless. Marcus tried to stay strong for his little sister Maya, but each night he could hear his mother quietly crying in the front seat. When the hunger grew unbearable, Marcus walked to the convenience store down the block. The owner, a gruff man who had seen too many kids like him, handed over a bag of day-old bread and said nothing. Marcus thanked him anyway. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Marcus looked at the building from which they'd been evicted. Lights were already on inside. Workers clearing out apartments, repainting walls, preparing for the new tenants who would never know the families who once lived there. He felt something shift inside him that night, a deep, burning anger. But beneath it, something else, resolve. He made a silent promise to himself and to his mother one day he would come back, not as a tenant, not as someone begging for mercy, but as the one who owned the keys. Weeks passed before they found a new place. It wasn't much, a cramped one-bedroom unit in a rundown neighborhood. The walls were thin and the floors creaked, but it was shelter. Denise picked up extra shifts at the diner, her hands cracked and swollen from long hours washing dishes. Marcus helped by finding odd jobs, cleaning yards, running errands, anything that earned a few dollars. Every coin he saved went into a jar he hid beneath his bed. School became both his escape and his battlefield. Teachers overlooked him. Classmates mocked his worn clothes, but Marcus had something none of them did: purpose. Every insult fueled him. Every closed door became another reason to keep going. Years passed, and the world changed little for families like his. Gentrification spread like wildfire, consuming block after block. But Marcus didn't give up. He worked through high school, graduated with honors, and earned a scholarship to study business and real estate development, the very industry that had once destroyed his family's life. College wasn't easy. The faces around him were different, privileged, confident, unburdened by fear or hunger. Some professors dismissed him. Some students whispered, questioning how a kid like him had even gotten in. But Marcus stayed quiet and listened. Every class, every lecture, every financial term was a weapon he was learning to use. At night, when others partied or slept, he worked, tutoring, waiting tables, anything to pay for what the scholarship didn't cover. And slowly, the dream that had been born out of pain began to take shape. He studied the housing market, the politics of development, the way banks favored certain investors and turned their backs on others. He learned how neighborhoods were reshaped, how communities were displaced, and how power was always tied to ownership. By the time Marcus graduated, he wasn't just a student anymore. He was a man with a plan. He started small, flipping one neglected property in a forgotten corner of the city. The bank had laughed when he first applied for a loan, but a small community credit union took a chance on him. He fixed the property himself, working through the nights, painting walls, repairing floors, and renting it to a single mother at an affordable rate. From there, he built piece by piece, one property after another. He reinvested every dollar, hiring people from the community, giving jobs to those others ignored. Years later, he stood at the edge of the same block where it had all begun, the block they had been evicted from. The luxury apartments his family had once been unfit to live in were now weathered, their shine gone. And through a chain of ownership transfers and quiet deals, Marcus's company had acquired the deeds to nearly every building in sight. He looked up at the same apartment where he had once watched his mother cry and realized the weight of what he'd achieved. The world had taken everything from them. Now, it was time to take something back, not out of revenge but out of justice. As the sun set behind the skyline, Marcus turned the key in the lock of the building that had once thrown them out. This time, the key belonged to him. And somewhere deep inside, he knew. This was only the beginning. When Marcus turned that key, it was more than the sound of a door unlocking. It was the sound of a past unburied. The echo of his childhood eviction still haunted the hallways of his memory, but now those echoes carried new meaning. What once symbolized loss now represented reclamation. He was no longer the boy standing helplessly on the curb. He was the man reshaping the block that had once erased him. Yet Marcus knew ownership wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The buildings he now controlled stood as symbols of his triumph, but the real battle was for the soul of the neighborhood itself. For years, this area had been left to decay, its residents driven out, its culture stripped away. He wanted to change that. He wanted justice, not just for his family, but for every voice silenced by greed and prejudice. He began with research, long nights in his office surrounded by blueprints and stacks of old records. He combed through city archives, tracing how property after property had been snatched from black and brown families through deceitful loans and rigged policies. He discovered how banks had denied them credit, how landlords had raised rents just high enough to drive them out, how developers had labeled their homes, blighted, to justify demolition. Every document he uncovered felt like uncovering a crime scene. He mapped it all out, each injustice, each eviction, each lost home. What emerged was more than just data. It was a portrait of systemic cruelty painted in red lines and broken lives. And at the center of that web, like a spider feeding on suffering, was the Connolly Development Group, the same company whose owner, Richard Connolly, had evicted his family all those years ago. Marcus remembered the name well. It was etched into every painful memory of that day. And now, all these years later, Connolly still thrived, richer, older, and more ruthless. His development stretched across the city, his empire built on the very neighborhoods he destroyed. But Marcus wasn't interested in confrontation. Not yet. He wanted something deeper, smarter. He wanted to dismantle Connolly's legacy from within, the same way Connolly had dismantled their community. He began quietly buying the forgotten, the properties too small or too unprofitable for Connolly to care about, old duplexes, abandoned stores, cracked lots no one wanted. To the untrained eye, it looked like Marcus was collecting scraps. But Marcus saw something different, a blueprint. Piece by piece, he was reclaiming the skeleton of the old neighborhood. He named his company Unity Developments, a subtle defiance of the greed and exclusion that had dominated the industry. Every project was guided by one principle: rebuild without displacing, restore without erasing. The people who had been pushed out would finally have a place to come home to. Still, not everyone believed in him. Some called him naive. Others said he'd never survive in a business run by men like Connolly. But Marcus had built his life on being underestimated. Each time someone doubted him, he worked harder, studied longer, planned sharper. It wasn't long before the ripples of his success reached Connolly's circle. Marcus's projects began gaining attention in local media. Articles celebrating a developer who was changing the face of urban renewal. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same system that had once denied him now praised him for playing by their rules, unaware that his real goal was to break those rules from the inside out. But fame had its dangers. Connolly's people soon came knocking, offering partnerships, investments, and even buyouts. They smiled, pretending it was business, but Marcus could see through the polished offers. They wanted control. They wanted to stop him before his influence grew. He refused them all, and that refusal caught their attention in ways he hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, his projects faced inspections, delays, zoning disputes, bureaucratic sabotage designed to crush him. Banks that once supported him began pulling out. Contractors mysteriously quit. Whispers spread that Unity Developments was financially unstable. Marcus recognized the pattern instantly. It was the same quiet warfare his mother had faced. Systems built to break you without ever saying your name. But this time, he was ready. He gathered his community around him. The same people who had once been displaced. He hired local crews, bartered services, created jobs. When the banks shut him out, he turned to the people. Crowdfunding, small investors, neighborhood collectives. What they lacked in wealth, they made up for in unity. Brick by brick, building by building, the block began to transform. Where there had been empty lots, there were now gardens. Where there had been silence, there was laughter again. Families who had been driven miles away began returning, some in disbelief, others in tears. Marcus had promised his mother he would bring their community back, and he was doing it. But success attracted attention, both good and dangerous. One morning, Marcus arrived at a construction site to find it vandalized. Graffiti sprayed across the walls read, "Go back where you belong." Tools were smashed, windows broken, permits torn down. It was a reminder that not everyone wanted to see a black man rebuilding a world they'd profited from destroying. Marcus stood there, staring at the wreckage. Anger boiled in his chest, but beneath it was something colder, clarity. This wasn't random hate. This was a message. Someone was watching, someone who saw him as a threat. That night, he sat in his dimly lit office, staring at a framed photo of his family. His mother had passed away just 2 years before, never getting to see the full extent of what he was building. He thought of her tired hands, her unbroken faith, her belief that good people would one day win. He made a silent vow. He wouldn't stop now. Not when he was this close. The next week, Marcus attended a real estate gala, one of the largest in the city. It was a world of luxury, champagne, gold lights, men in suits worth more than his first house. And there, across the room, he saw him, Richard Connolly. The man looked older, heavier, but still carried that same air of arrogance, the same coldness Marcus remembered from the day they were evicted. Connolly didn't recognize him. Why would he? Marcus had been just another nameless face in the crowd back then. But soon he would remember, because Marcus had a plan, a quiet, meticulous plan that would make Connolly face what he had built his empire on, and what it had cost others. As the night went on, Marcus approached a group of investors. Among them was one of Connolly's closest business partners. Marcus introduced himself, speaking with the calm confidence he had earned through years of struggle. The investors listened. Some even leaned closer. His words had weight, the kind born from truth, from pain, from purpose. By the end of the night, Marcus had secured new allies, not just in business, but in vision. People who were tired of Connolly's greed, who saw what Marcus was doing and wanted to be part of it. And as he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights reflecting off his face, he smiled for the first time in weeks. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was his to walk now. The boy who had once slept in a car was now reshaping the very skyline that had looked down on him. And soon, very soon, Richard Connolly would learn that some debts can't be erased. They can only be repaid. Success, no matter how righteous, has a way of stirring envy and fear among those who thrive on control. For Marcus, that truth revealed itself faster than he ever expected. The morning after the gala, he awoke to a barrage of calls. His assistant's frantic voice, his project manager's disbelief, his lawyer's warning. Something had shifted overnight. Permits that had been approved were suddenly under review. City inspectors appeared unannounced, halting construction for safety concerns. And worse, his funding accounts were mysteriously frozen due to an internal audit. Marcus felt the old sting of injustice returning, that familiar ache that reminded him of the day his family's home was taken. He knew this wasn't coincidence. It was retaliation. The system that had once destroyed his family's stability was now striking back to destroy his dream. Connolly had noticed him. Behind closed doors, Connolly Development Group had begun a quiet campaign to discredit Marcus and Unity Developments. Anonymous articles appeared online questioning his background, implying that his sudden success was built on shady dealings. Local talk shows debated whether diversity developers were taking advantage of the system. What had begun as admiration now twisted into suspicion, the kind designed to chip away at public faith. But Marcus was no longer the powerless boy watching his mother plead for compassion. He had learned the rules and the ways to bend them. He called an emergency meeting with his team. They gathered in the modest conference room that doubled as his office, a symbol of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. He looked around at the faces that depended on him: construction workers, community leaders, small investors, mothers who'd bet their savings on his promise. They were the heart of his mission, and now they stood on the edge of losing it all. He made a decision. They wouldn't fight this battle in silence. Marcus began documenting everything: every permit, every inspection report, every denied loan, every threat. He compiled the evidence, building a paper trail of discrimination and corruption so clear that even the most loyal bureaucrat couldn't ignore it. He reached out to investigative journalists who'd once written about systemic housing inequality, offering them something they couldn't resist: proof. Weeks passed. The pressure mounted. Construction delays grew costlier. Investors grew restless. And yet, amid the chaos, the community rallied. Residents volunteered to guard the construction sites at night, protecting the new buildings from vandalism. Retired teachers, former tenants, and young students stood side by side with workers, united by a cause greater than bricks and cement. Marcus visited the construction site daily, walking the same streets that once witnessed his family's humiliation. He could still remember his mother's tears as their furniture sat in the rain, neighbors watching in silence. But now, where that memory once lived, he saw rebirth. Families moving into new homes, children playing in the yards, laughter echoing between walls that he had built. It was progress, fragile, beautiful, and dangerous. Because soon after the sabotage escalated. One evening, as Marcus reviewed contracts in his office, his phone buzzed with a message that froze his blood fire at Eastwood Project. He rushed to the site, his car slicing through the city's dark streets. When he arrived, flames devoured the half-finished building. Firefighters battled the inferno, but the structure was doomed. The air reeked of burning wood and chemicals. Too many chemicals. This wasn't an accident. It was arson. Marcus stood behind the police tape, watching the years of struggle and sweat turn to smoke. It wasn't just a building. It was hope, gone in minutes. His chest ached with anger, but his eyes burned with something stronger: determination. The next morning, the media swarmed the site. Some claimed negligence, others whispered sabotage. But amid the chaos, Marcus saw Connolly arrive in his expensive car, pretending concern, offering condolences to the press. To the cameras, he appeared sympathetic, even charitable, promising to help rebuild what was lost. But Marcus saw through it. It was a performance, a reminder that power didn't just live in money. It lived in perception. And for the first time, Marcus understood something vital: this fight wasn't just about property. It was about narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled the truth. That realization changed everything. He called his media contact, the journalist he'd trusted with his evidence. Together, they began crafting a story, not of victimhood, but of exposure. The article that followed was more than reporting. It was revelation. It laid bare decades of housing discrimination, the rigged systems, the corporations like Connolly Development Group profiting from it. It connected the dots, name by name, policy by policy, showing the world how an empire was built on the suffering of others. When the piece went live, it spread like wildfire. The city was shaken. Activists took to the streets. Former tenants came forward with their own stories. Politicians who once looked away suddenly issued statements. And at the center of it all was Marcus. Not as a developer, but as a symbol of resistance. Connolly was furious. He held press conferences denying everything, calling Marcus opportunist playing the race card. His lawyers filed defamation threats. His associates withdrew from Marcus's projects, and the tension between them turned personal. But for the first time, Marcus wasn't afraid. He'd already lost everything once. This time, he had nothing left to fear, and everything to gain. The tide began to turn slowly. Donations poured in. New investors, inspired by his resilience, offered support. The same communities once forgotten by the system began rebuilding together, block by block. Yet even as hope bloomed again, Marcus knew the war was far from over. Connolly still held enormous power. He still owned most of the land, still had the city in his pocket. And as long as he remained untouchable, the system would keep swallowing people like Marcus whole. One evening, while reviewing redevelopment plans, Marcus received a letter, an official city notice. Connolly had filed a petition to acquire several lots adjacent to Marcus's developments. If approved, Connolly's expansion would surround Marcus's block entirely, suffocating his progress. It was a chess move, deliberate, strategic, and devastating. Marcus read the document twice. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. The man who once took his childhood home was now trying to box him in again. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the city skyline beyond his window. The same skyline Connolly had built, the same skyline Marcus intended to reclaim. This was no longer just business. This was history repeating itself. And this time, Marcus intended to rewrite it. Because while Connolly played his game of greed and manipulation, Marcus had something stronger: truth, community, and the will to endure. As the city slept, Marcus began drafting a plan, one that would not only protect his development but expose the final secret that Connolly had hidden for decades. And when the morning light broke across the city's rooftops, Marcus knew the next move was his. The following days unfolded like a storm, one that Marcus had both expected and dreaded. The city buzzed with controversy, split between those who saw him as a hero and those who labeled him a troublemaker. His name flooded headlines, talk shows, and social media feeds. For every supporter who praised his courage, there was another who called him arrogant, claiming he was playing the race card to tear down a good man's reputation. But Marcus didn't have time for public opinion. He was focused on the one thing that mattered: stopping Connolly from seizing the remaining land. The petition Connolly filed wasn't just another business move. It was a strategic assault designed to corner Marcus financially. If Connolly's acquisition went through, his company would control the surrounding lots, driving up construction costs and choking Marcus's redevelopment plans. But as Marcus examined the legal paperwork line by line, something strange caught his eye. A set of dates, a name, and an old signature buried deep in the fine print. The name was hauntingly familiar. It was his father's. Marcus's chest tightened. He stared at the document again, his mind racing. His father, the man who'd worked 3 jobs to keep their family home, had once owned a small piece of this land, decades before Connolly's empire ever existed. Yet the records showed something else entirely: that the land had been transferred, under suspicious terms, weeks before the eviction that destroyed their lives. It didn't make sense. His father would never have sold that property willingly. Marcus dug deeper. He contacted the county archives, requested old deeds, permits, and zoning reports. What he discovered over the following week made his blood run cold. The eviction that tore his family apart hadn't been about unpaid taxes or missed deadlines. It had been about acquisition. Connolly's company had used its influence to manipulate city records, marking homes in the area as abandoned or unsafe. Families, mostly black and low income, were forced out. Within months, Connolly's associates swooped in, buying the land at pennies on the dollar. It was a theft disguised as policy, a generational robbery hidden behind bureaucracy. For the first time, Marcus saw the full picture. His father hadn't failed their family. The system had. And the man responsible for their suffering had built his empire on the ashes of their neighborhood. Marcus sat in his office, surrounded by documents and faded photographs. He picked up one. His father standing proudly in front of their old house, smiling despite the cracked paint and worn roof. That smile had meant everything. It was pride, resilience, hope, all the things Connolly's greed had stolen. And now, Marcus knew exactly what to do. He compiled the evidence meticulously, building a timeline of every unlawful acquisition, every manipulated zoning report, every eviction order linked to Connolly's developments. He gathered testimonies from other families who'd been displaced, their stories echoing his own. Different names, same injustice. With each piece of evidence, Marcus's determination hardened into something immovable. But this time, he didn't go to the press. He went straight to the people. He organized a community forum at the Eastwood Center, inviting residents from every corner of the district. The turnout was overwhelming: old families, new tenants, young activists, retired workers, all united by shared pain and shared hope. Marcus stood before them and laid everything bare. He told them about the deception, the fraud, the decades of exploitation. He showed them the documents, the forged signatures, the evidence that their neighborhoods had been stolen under the guise of urban renewal. The room fell silent as the truth sank in. For years, they had carried the shame of losing their homes. Now they realized it had never been their fault. That night marked a turning point. Within days, protests erupted outside Connolly's offices. News outlets picked up the story again, this time with undeniable proof. The same journalist who'd first exposed Connolly's discrimination returned, publishing a follow-up article that struck the city like an earthquake. Empire of Lies. How Connolly built his fortune on stolen land. The fallout was immediate. Politicians who had once praised Connolly began distancing themselves. Lawsuits poured in. City officials called for investigations. For the first time in his life, the untouchable man at the top began to crack. But power rarely surrenders quietly. A week later, Marcus's office was broken into. Files were stolen, computers wiped. His car was vandalized, threats scrawled across the windshield. The message was clear: stop or pay the price. Yet fear had long since lost its grip on Marcus. He refused to back down. Instead, he doubled his security, rebuilt his case, and prepared to go to court. His lawyer warned him that Connolly's team would fight ruthlessly, dragging the process for years, trying to drain his finances and reputation. But Marcus had something stronger than money: community support. Donations flowed in from across the city. Volunteers offered their time and expertise. What started as one man's fight had become a movement. As the case gained traction, the public's perception began to shift. People saw in Marcus not just a developer, but a symbol of what it meant to rise above oppression, to fight back against the systems built to silence them. But the closer he got to victory, the more dangerous the battle became. One evening, Marcus received an anonymous package. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no name, just a single file labeled Connolly Confidential. Marcus hesitated before plugging it into his computer. When the screen loaded, his pulse quickened. It was a video recording, grainy but unmistakable. Connolly sat in an office, years younger, speaking with city officials about strategic redevelopment. His words were damning. He spoke casually about displacing undesirable residents to clear space for luxury condos. He laughed about how nobody would care if those families disappeared. It was the smoking gun. Marcus watched the video twice, every second burning into his mind. He realized this wasn't just about his family anymore. This was about every person who had ever been silenced, displaced, or erased by greed disguised as progress. He forwarded the file to his legal team and the journalist who had stood by him. The next morning, the video went public. Within hours, it went viral. The city exploded in outrage. Protesters surrounded Connolly's headquarters. Former allies withdrew from his company. The mayor announced a full investigation into decades of corruption and housing fraud. Marcus watched it all unfold from his office window, the same skyline that once symbolized his family's loss now shimmering with poetic justice. But he knew it wasn't over yet. Connolly still held power, and men like him didn't fall easily. The court date was set. The city would soon witness the showdown between the man who stole homes and the man who rebuilt them. Marcus closed his laptop and looked out at the construction sites below. Homes rising from the ground, built by the very people once denied a place to belong. He could almost hear his father's voice in the wind, steady and proud. The boy who lost everything was ready to take it all back. And as the day of reckoning approached, one thought echoed in his mind like a promise: this time, justice will have my family's name on it. The courthouse stood like a monument of consequence that morning, cold, imposing, and drenched in tension. News cameras lined the steps, their flashing lights turning the stone facade into a storm of chaos. Inside, whispers filled every hallway, a low hum of speculation and anticipation. The city was watching. For weeks, the case had dominated headlines. What began as a local dispute had evolved into a reckoning, a confrontation between truth and privilege, between history and justice. On one side stood Marcus Reed, the man who once lost everything to corruption. On the other, Edward Connolly, the developer whose empire had been built upon deceit. The evidence Marcus had gathered, The fraudulent deeds, the displaced families' testimonies, and the damning video had shaken the foundations of Connolly's empire. But Connolly wasn't the type to surrender. His legal team was an army of seasoned attorneys, each paid enough to turn lies into language. They painted Marcus as an opportunist, a man driven by vengeance, twisting facts to build fame. But Marcus didn't waver. He sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped, eyes steady. For years, he had watched others define his worth. Not anymore. This was his moment, not just for himself, but for every voice silenced by greed and prejudice. The trial unfolded like a battle of ideologies. Connolly's lawyers argued that his company had acted within legal boundaries, that the families had voluntarily vacated, and that any overlap between his developments and Marcus's past was pure coincidence. It was a familiar defense, polished, rehearsed, and heartless. Then came Marcus's turn. His attorney presented the evidence piece by piece. They laid out the eviction patterns, the falsified documents, and the video, that single recording that exposed Connolly's cruelty in his own words. The courtroom fell silent as his voice echoed through the speakers. There was no denying it now. The mask had slipped. Connolly sat still, jaw tight, his confident smirk replaced with the cold realization that his empire was cracking. As witnesses came forward, the full weight of his crimes became undeniable. Elderly residents recalled being forced from their homes under false pretexts. Former employees confessed to being ordered to alter inspection reports. One even admitted to being paid off to remove safety violations from city records. Every testimony chipped away at Connolly's image, revealing the rot beneath the marble. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus took the stand. He spoke not as a businessman, but as a son, the child of a man who had been robbed of dignity and home. He described the humiliation his family faced, the nights they spent in a cramped motel, the way people looked at them like they were less than human. His words carried the weight of every broken promise, every denied opportunity. And when he spoke of his father's dream, that one day Marcus would build something lasting from their pain, the courtroom went silent. Even the judge, who had heard countless cases of greed and deceit, leaned forward. By the time Marcus finished, the air in the room felt heavy with truth. It was no longer just a legal dispute. It was a moral reckoning. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered in growing numbers. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for Eastwood," "War not disposable," and "Rebuild the block." What had started as Marcus's personal crusade had become a movement for the entire city. As the trial stretched into its final days, Connolly grew desperate. Reports surfaced that he had tried to bribe witnesses, threaten whistleblowers, even destroy digital records. But it was too late. The evidence was everywhere, shared online, preserved in multiple backups, impossible to erase. Marcus, though exhausted, remained composed. He had learned long ago that real strength wasn't loud. It was steady, patient, unyielding. Then came the final day. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat taken, every corner filled. Marcus's mother sat in the front row, clutching an old photograph of their family home, the house they once lost. Beside her were neighbors, activists, and former victims of Connolly's developments. On the other side, Connolly sat isolated, his once formidable presence diminished to a shadow of arrogance. When the judge entered, the room fell to silence. The verdict would decide everything. The jury filed in, faces solemn and unreadable. Minutes stretched like hours. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing with years of struggle. Then, the foreperson stood and read the words that would change everything. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Edward Connolly, guilty." Gasps rippled through the room. The rest of the words blurred in Marcus's ears. Fraud, forgery, unlawful displacement, civil rights violations. It didn't matter how they were phrased. The truth had finally won. The crowd erupted into emotion. Cheers, sobs, applause that filled the chamber like thunder. Marcus sat still for a moment, the weight of victory washing over him slowly, almost painfully. For so long he had lived under the shadow of injustice. Now, for the first time, he felt the sun. Connolly was sentenced to pay massive restitution, his company stripped of assets, his developments placed under investigation. The properties he had stolen, including the very block where Marcus's family once lived, were ordered to be returned to the city for redevelopment under community ownership. Marcus walked out of the courthouse into a sea of cameras and supporters. Reporters shouted his name, asking how it felt to win. But Marcus didn't speak. He just looked up at the sky, eyes glistening, and whispered a silent thank you to his father, to his past, to the part of himself that refused to give up. Yet even in triumph, he knew the journey wasn't over. Justice had been served in court, but healing the wounds of decades would take time. The land was still scarred, the people still rebuilding, and Marcus intended to lead that rebuilding himself. In the weeks that followed, he poured his energy into the Eastwood Renewal Project, a community-led initiative to restore the block Connolly had destroyed. Families who had once been scattered returned. Homes rose again, designed with dignity and fairness. The same streets that once symbolized loss became a symbol of rebirth. But amid the celebration, Marcus received one last message, an anonymous email. It contained a short note. You may have won the trial, but you haven't won the war. Look deeper. There's more buried than you know. Attached was a single document, a property deed with Connolly's signature dated 5 years after the supposed transfer of ownership. It hinted at something even larger, perhaps a network beyond Connolly, a system that still thrived in the shadows. Marcus stared at the screen, a chill creeping through him. For a brief moment, he thought the war was over, but maybe this was just the beginning. He closed the laptop, exhaled deeply, and looked out the window of his rebuilt office. Children played in the streets below. The block was alive again. Hope was alive again. He had fought one man and won, but now he would take on the system itself. Because this time, Marcus wasn't just defending his family's legacy. He was fighting for every family that had ever been told they didn't belong. Months had passed since the trial that shook the city. The headlines had faded, the protests quieted, and life slowly settled into a fragile rhythm of rebuilding. Yet, for Marcus Reed, the work was only just beginning. The block that had once symbolized his family's loss was now under his stewardship, not as an owner in name, but as a guardian of its future. The Eastwood Renewal Project had taken root. What was once a graveyard of abandoned houses and boarded-up storefronts was transforming into a vibrant community. Construction crews filled the streets daily, not with the sound of destruction, but of rebirth. Marcus spent his mornings walking those streets, greeting workers, and visiting the families who had returned. Each home had a story, a piece of history stitched into the larger fabric of struggle and perseverance. There was the Harris family, who once fled in the night after being threatened by developers. Now they were back, painting the porch of their newly built home. There was old Mrs. Turner, who had lost her grocery store decades ago. Marcus helped her reopen it, this time under her full ownership, free from predatory leases. Every success filled Marcus with quiet satisfaction, but beneath it all lingered a shadow, that mysterious message he had received after the trial. The email, with its warning about something more buried, haunted him. At first, he tried to ignore it, convincing himself that Connolly's downfall had ended the corruption. But late at night, when the streets went still, the thought would return. What if the real rot went deeper? Into the city, the banks, even the government that had allowed it all to happen. Determined to uncover the truth, Marcus began digging. He revisited old case files, cross-referenced city records, and interviewed former employees from Connolly's company. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Connolly hadn't acted alone. A network of officials, investors, and bankers had enabled his empire for decades, quietly profiting off the displacement of black families and poor residents. The evictions, the forged documents, the redevelopment. It was part of a system designed to erase communities like Eastwood from the map. This realization reignited something fierce within Marcus. He knew tearing down one man wasn't enough. He had to expose the entire structure. But this time, he wanted to do it differently. Instead of fighting through the courts, he decided to fight through creation, to rebuild the very system that had once excluded him. He gathered a team: activists, urban planners, educators, and local business owners. Together, they founded the Eastwood Cooperative, a community-owned development organization that gave residents full control over their neighborhoods. Every member had a voice. Every decision was made collectively. Profits from businesses and housing went back into community funds, scholarships, health clinics, and cultural centers. The vision spread like wildfire. Other displaced families from neighboring blocks reached out, inspired by Marcus's model. What started as one project soon became a movement, a blueprint for rebuilding power from the ground up. Still, not everyone celebrated Marcus's rise. Hidden forces watched from the sidelines. the same corporations and politicians who had profited from Eastwood's destruction. They tried to discredit him through the media, planting stories about mismanagement and radicalization. Anonymous threats resurfaced, warning him to stay in his lane. But Marcus didn't back down. He'd already been broken once. There was nothing left to fear. The real test came when the city council announced plans for a massive luxury complex just a few blocks from Eastwood. It was being funded by a conglomerate that had quietly acquired old properties through shell companies, one of which traced back to Connolly's former partners. The project threatened to undo everything Marcus had built. At the public hearing, Marcus stood before the council, the same institution that had once ignored his family's cries. The room was packed, filled with reporters, residents, and investors. He presented evidence linking the development to Connolly's corrupt network, showing how the same tactics were still in play, just under new names. His words were measured, calm, but each one struck like a hammer. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of truth, of the right to exist, of the legacy that could not be erased. Behind him, dozens of Eastwood residents stood united, faces of every age and background, all wearing shirts that read, "Will belong here." By the end of the hearing, the council had no choice but to vote against the development. The room erupted in cheers, but Marcus simply closed his eyes and exhaled. This victory felt different. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was earned, patient, and rooted in justice. In the months that followed, Marcus's efforts drew national attention. Documentaries were made about Eastwood's transformation. Universities invited him to speak about urban renewal and racial equity. But what moved him most was seeing the children. Kids playing where his father's house once stood, running through parks built on the very soil where his family had been evicted. They didn't know the pain of the past, only the hope of what had been rebuilt. One afternoon, Marcus visited the community center named after his father, the Samuel Reed Learning Hub. Inside, walls were lined with photographs of Eastwood's history from its vibrant beginnings to the dark years of displacement, and finally to its rebirth. Standing before those images, Marcus felt the full weight of his journey. He thought about his father's final words, about dignity and persistence, and realized that this, all of it, was the fulfillment of that promise. The pain, the loss, the struggle, it had all led to this moment of restoration. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Marcus stood on the rooftop of his building overlooking the block. The lights below glowed warm and alive, each window a symbol of resilience. The scent of home-cooked food drifted through the air, mingling with laughter and the faint sound of music from the park. This was the sound of life reclaimed. And yet, Marcus knew his mission wasn't over. The system he fought still existed in many forms. Across cities, in boardrooms, in policies crafted to keep people divided. But he also knew something those systems didn't, that once a community learns its strength, it can never be silenced again. The email warning had been right. There was more buried than he'd known. But maybe that wasn't a threat. Maybe it was a call to keep digging, to keep exposing, to keep rebuilding. As the stars emerged, Marcus smiled to himself. He no longer felt anger, only purpose. The boy who once stood helpless outside his family's evicted home had become the man who rebuilt that world from ashes. Now, he didn't just own the block. He owned the future. The block stood not as a monument to revenge, but to redemption, unity, and power reclaimed. And in every brick, every streetlight, every sound of laughter echoing through Eastwood, lived the enduring truth that no one could ever take away again. You can evict a family from their home, but you can never evict their spirit.